I'll just begin introducing the speaker. Today we've got the joy and the privilege of introducing Professor Don Passey as our speaker. Don Passey's research explores how digital technologies support innovative and inclusive practices in educational home and community settings for learners across the lifespan. In addition to being a pivotal member of the team here at the Department for Educational Research, Don's findings are consistently informing important decisions for policy and practice with, international groups, government departments, agencies, local authorities, and private companies and corporations, in addition to those of us who are influenced by in terms of individual research. Lots and lots of interest in today's session. Don, thanks very much for spending time and effort with us. We're really looking forward to hearing about parents, education and digital technologies. I'll be here if you need anything I can help with, and I'll keep an eye on the chat so you don't need to be distracted by that. Hope you enjoy it as much as I'm sure we will. And I'll see you in about 45 minutes or so. Thanks, Don.
Okay. Thanks ever so much, Phil. Thanks for your kind invitation and for being willing to lead on this session, and thanks also to Dee for all of the background that you've done on this and encouraging me to be involved and to make sure that I've got details to you at least on time, if not before time. And thank you everyone for coming along to the session. And I'll speak on this topic of parents, education and digital technologies. And I'll try to keep to time, but I'm sure that if I don't manage that Phil will be happy to interrupt me at any point. So just see if I can, yeah. I should also say when I'm talking through this topic that when I talk about parents, I am including parents, guardians and carers. So I'm taking on board, if you like, all of those who have responsibilities for young people and support them in their endeavours. Just to give you a bit of background, my interest in this field of parents, education and technology is pretty long-standing. My original interest was actually to do with how digital technologies were being introduced into education and educational practice, and I was interested in how that was shifting homework practices. And I published a paper relatively early on that topic. And since then, I have kept in touch and have published at various points and have researched on this field across that period of time. Couple of background things, I think, which are important in sort of setting the scene for this topic. First of all, an early review that was done on parental involvement. And this was a report that was done for the Department of what was then Department of Education and Skills in England, done by Deforge and Abushar. A very well-known report at the time and very influential, and it indicated how parental involvement could affect positive outcomes for learners. So even at that time, there was an indication, a strong indication, that parental involvement had a positive effect. And that, of course, is one of the main reasons, I think, that people have looked at this whole area of parental involvement. Another, what I would say, was a follow-up report, again reporting to the government department by Harrison Goodall, was, I think, very influential because it distinguished between this idea of involvement and engagement, where engagement was to do with much more direct interaction rather than involvement, which was a general form of support, people being involved at a more general level. Engagement meant that there was much more of a direct interaction, both with the school and with learners. So there's this distinguishment that was brought forward. And of course, since that time, the question that's always been raised is, how could this be achieved? How could you achieve parental engagement so that it would affect the outcomes for learners. And that's been a question that I've been interested in from the technology point of view. How is it that digital technologies might be able to bring about some of those positive effects? What I'm going to look at within this seminar are three things really, which I think I've outlined within the abstract that's gone around. The first is to ask what roles or functions should parents be involved in when children are attending schools or colleges or universities. Because I think that those roles or functions, as I hope that I will demonstrate, are important in terms of these ideas of engagement. And the second question would be, how have digital technologies affected shifts in roles, particularly during and since the COVID-19 pandemic? Are they still happening, and to what extent? And then the third is, what shifts and changes can I talk about that I've done in recent times with colleagues, which have looked at this idea of digital technologies that are leading to parental engagement. So those are the three sorts of questions that I'm going to look at within this session. Just to introduce you to my colleagues who've been involved in the work that I'm going to talk about. Hazel Woodhouse is with the School of Education in Waikato University in New Zealand. Amina Charania is with the School of Education in the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai, India. And John Anderson is with the Ulster University, again, the School of Education in Northern Ireland. And it's been my privilege to work with those three people over a number of years. And I will be highlighting the work that we've done together during this session. And just to say that the recent work that I will talk about in this field is an academic paper that was done for the Malta Journal of Education, which was looking at effects and shifts arising with regard to parental roles and responsibilities during the COVID-19 pandemic. Secondly, with all of those colleagues above, we guest edited a special issue of STEL, and I'll talk about the key papers in that, and we were able to put together an editorial that drew together points that arose from those really important papers that are easily accessible. And then I'll also talk about recent joint research, which has been done in New Zealand and Northern Ireland, where we've now produced an academic paper and a research report. And then I'll talk about the implications of that and where I see it going next. Just an overview of some of the things that I'm going to talk about in terms of answering those sorts of questions. I think it's worth talking about some of the existing models and frameworks that there are that try to highlight aspects of parental involvement and engagement. As you'll see from what I'm going to outline, most of these focus on or from schools rather than from across the educational spectrum. So there's actually much lower volumes of literature with regard to parental engagement that goes outside of the school sector. Some of the reasons for that seem to be to do with this idea of ages of young people lead to social and psychological changes, and this idea that young people should become more independent as they become older, and therefore the idea of engagement and involvement shifts across the education sector. So that seems to be a basis on which quite a lot of this work is thought through and is determined. However, one of the things that has happened here, I think quite significantly, and has tended to shift that view in some respects for some people, is that COVID-19 and the pandemic shifted roles and responsibilities right across the education sector. It didn't shift it just for the school-based sector, it actually shifted it across the sector. And what we now know to be the case is that actually, as a result of those different forms of engagement, some of the outcomes for that were positive, some of them were neutral, and some of them were negative. What we also know is that as a result of the pandemic, some of those forms of engagement that arose during the pandemic have persisted, but they've not persisted in all places, and they've not persisted in all places in the same way. But we do know that there has been an effect of those changes. If we think about the sort of models of engagement and involvement, the models actually that were derived fairly early on, and still to some extent persist. However, I will highlight that these models didn't really take account of technological changes. So the technological environment when these models were developed is rather different from that we find today. And also, it doesn't really take into account the types of social interaction and social changes that have happened even over those 20 or so years. And part of that is because of the effect of digital technologies. We know that the forms of social interaction that can happen as a result of social media, for example, are different to those that could happen in 2000 or so. So I'll come back to that. But just to say that I'm going to show 3 different types of models which relate to this idea of how you can view parental engagement or involvement. And Epstein's is the first of these. And the interesting thing here is that Epstein looks at this very much from the ideas of the ways in which parents can be involved, and identifies these 6 different types of involvement. So the idea that parents can become involved with education in terms of decision making, or they can volunteer to undertake certain activities, or they can communicate, or they can be involved in general support through parenting, or they can engage with learning at home, or they can collaborate across the wider community. So Epstein's view of looking at the model of engagement and involvement was very much to do with the types of actions that parents could undertake, and these 6 were identified. Hoover, Dempsey and Sandler, who looked at this a little bit later, a few years afterwards, came up with a different type of model or framework. And they came up with a framework which was in 5 levels. So the idea was that one could move from, in essence, one level to another. And that this was seen as a sort of progression in terms of involvement or engagement, that one would move from one level to the next. And what they were looking at really were the factors and features which were, in essence, enabling or persuading or supporting the ways in which parents could become involved in education. So at level 1, it was to do with what was influencing basic involvement, i.e. being willing to go to the institution, being willing to talk to teachers, etc. And then the second was going beyond that, which is to do with the choice of involvement, which then relates back to Epstein's view, this idea that someone could be involved in communicating, but could also take a choice in terms of decision making, for example, with regard to institutions, and become involved in decision making processes. Then they went on to the third one, which was mechanisms, the ways in which that would happen. So the mechanisms of involvement, the actual processes the groupings that would happen, that would enable that to happen. And then at level 4, they were talking more about the tempering or mediating variables, more of the ways in which the involvement or engagement was more nuanced to allow particular engagement to happen. And then at level 5, to do with the idea of student outcomes, that parents were involved in order to influence and support student outcomes. So that was the different way that Hoover Dempsey and Sandler were looking at this. And then the third one comes from Walker and a number of colleagues. And Walker and colleagues looked at it much more from psychological concerns or motivations, the drivers that were happening behind the scenes. And again, this was done in terms of levels. So what they were looking at were, if you like, the concerns or motivations that were leading to engagement or non-engagement. So they weren't looking at it purely from a way of supporting involvement or engagement. They were looking at it from a broader perspective of the ways in which beliefs, for example, or how invitations were perceived or life contexts were affecting the positive, neutral, or negative influences upon involvement or engagement. And then they were looking at the parental forms of engagement, again, through concerns and motivations. So they were looking at this very much from the individual perspective and were saying that there are many, many factors here which arise at an individual parent, carer, or guardian perspective that can influence what's happening with regard to that involvement or engagement. One of the things that is interesting, of course, is all of those were models that were derived prior to the current situation, i.e. the digital situation and the pandemic and post-pandemic situation. And one of the things, of course, that arose during the COVID-19 pandemic was that there were shifts in terms of the ways that parents were involved, often with education. And there were 6, I would say, ways in which those changes happened. And the first was the teaching medium. So this moved largely from a face-to-face to an online medium. So the medium that was happening shifted. And at the same time, there was a shift in terms of teaching mode. So the mode, going from classroom-based, became remote or blended sometimes, or hybrid. So that was from a teaching perspective. But from a learning perspective, there were also similar changes. So the learning medium changed. It changed from being largely face-to-face to much more screen-based. And the mode changed, much more from direct to indirect, whether the communications technologies or the digital devices that were in place allowed synchronous or asynchronous. Nevertheless, there was a change in mode from a direct to an indirect set of interactions. The learning environment also changed. It changed from a classroom situation to a home-based situation. And in essence, because of those changes happening, parent, guardian, and carer roles also changed. So the idea of parents, guardians, or carers offering general support was shifted, because in many cases, parents, guardians, and carers were involved in a different range of roles. They could even be involved as a part-time teacher. They could have been involved as a tutor or a facilitator or a counsellor. So, for example, we know that during the pandemic period, there were parents who were supporting their children at a subject content level and were supporting their online work. Similarly, they were operating, some parents were operating as a tutor, i.e. they were enabling the learners to ask questions which they would then answer. and they would enable someone to have contact with others to be able to answer those questions. They could be acting as a facilitator. In other words, they were enabling access to other resources, to point to other resources that would be available and possible. Or they could act as a counsellor, i.e. that they could support in social or psychological ways. And we know that all of those happened at various times, in various ways, and in various places. It was not uniform, but they happened. So the shift was quite significant. Post COVID-19, we were interested in how that shift had happened, and that was really the way in which the STEL special issue arose, and how the four of us worked together as guest editors. And on this, we received 10 really quite important papers that gave us different perspectives on these shifts. And just to briefly explain those, the first one was very much an orthoethnographic study, looking at an experience as a parent of how one coped with the situation of movement from a school to a home-based situation with distance learning. That was very much a school age based one, but the second one was very much at a higher education level. So we were also able to get ideas through an ethnographic study of how that was affecting the shifts at a higher education level. And interestingly, there were similarities clearly between them because of the ways in which that shift happened. It happened in relatively similar ways. And then the third of those papers was looking at it from the point of homeschooling, where children had special educational needs, and whether actually that was something that enabled lessons to be learned not only in the home but also in the school subsequently. And the fourth one looked at it from a parenting mediation perspective, i.e. what did parents need to do in order to support their children, and what digital competence did they need and did they acquire during that time. And this was an interesting paper which was looking at it from in India, in parts of India. And similarly, the fifth paper here was also based in India, and this was looking at pre-primary, and again, what effects the technology was having in the pre-primary area. The second set, carrying on from that, the first of these was set in New Zealand and was looking at parental engagement and basically what digital spaces were offering, what benefits they might be offering, and what they were not, both during the COVID period and subsequently. And the following one looked at it through Northern Ireland, which is looking at how parents were responding during the emergency remote teaching and subsequently. And the paper that followed also looked at this in Northern Ireland, but looked at it from the point of view of preparedness. How were schools prepared, as well as how were homes prepared? Were they prepared? And what were the factors that, or some of the factors that enabled some homes to be better prepared and some schools to be better prepared to support this shift and change during the crisis? And the ninth paper was looking at this from a more international perspective, and was talking about the change of role from the idea of parents being a gatekeeper to parents being a proto-online tutor, which I hinted at in the previous slides. And then the final one looked at this from the point of view of a global evolution of parental engagement and digitally connected families, and actually made the point that in many ways parents have taken a lead with regard to the use of digital technologies and supported learning in some places that hasn't necessarily been explored widely, but nevertheless has been taken up in certain places very strongly. So what we were able to get from these papers was a very, very rich picture across the sector, but looking at it from different types of perspective, which enabled us to draw out some key points, which we then wanted to follow up in some joint research work, which was done with colleagues in New Zealand and Northern Ireland. And for that work, we involved 4 primary schools in New Zealand and 4 in Northern Ireland. And what we were looking at was exploring uses of digital technologies and how they built connections between families and schools when children were transitioning. So we were looking at it initially at that very early stage of transition when children are moving from home to a situation where they're engaging with the school. And the key question that we asked was, to what extent are digital technologies being used by a school to develop supportive links with families in their transition to school? And we came out with a whole variety of findings, many of which surprised us. We found, for example, that all of these schools were using a variety of online and social media applications where they were enabling connections between the family, between the home and the school. And also we were finding that where there were a range of languages spoken, they were using Google Translate in order to make material more accessible and messages more accessible to families. They were using multiple online channels. They matched up with parental preferences where they could, but the most common form of communication was text messages. And they could either send those out by volume to all parents, or they could send them out individually to individual parents. And using the applications that they had, they were able to identify whether the parents actually received them or not. So in terms of communication, they were the schools were able to aid their communication and to understand what was happening to their communication a lot. They were also answering questions from parents that were coming back either by email or by text. And this clearly had an effect on when this was happening. And I can come back to that point. But one of the issues, challenges, things that have to be managed as a result of this is that, of course, if you're increasing communication, you're also potentially increasing the times when communication can happen. And that is something that may need to be managed in particular ways. What was interesting is that communication was pretty much happening on a daily basis. That news about events, news about ideas of homework, news about that was going through messages, often illustrated, were happening pretty much on a daily basis. So this was very, very regular communication, which was aided by forms of applications. So the other issue, of course, was the privacy. They needed to be concerned about privacy. And they tended to use closed groups. So they were using technologies where they recognized that privacy was something which was taken into accommodation, and so that they could be clear that everything was secure, and parents could be clear about that security as well. It was found, however, that there were parents who either couldn't or felt that they didn't want to engage through digital technologies, and still schools maintained their contact with them, either through telephone calls or by sending out through paper-based resources. And this also showed quite a shift in terms of that diversity of communication which was happening. They were also using learning environments as well as applications, as well as apps, to provide insights for learning and to encourage parents to be involved in that, to respond to what they were seeing, to respond to questions that they were asking. And as a result of using technologies, these schools were monitoring and reviewing these different technologies quite regularly, but they were also gaining insights back from the parents. So one of the things that was happening was that they were finding out if their parents were happy with the forms of communication and how they were communicating. They identified, therefore, the things that were working well, and it was those things that were working well that tended to determine how they wanted to move forward with the uses of the technologies. Although cost, of course, became a factor, either to a lesser or a greater extent, depending. But the main reason for this form of use of digital technology and selection of digital technology was to ensure that the communication was effective, and as a result, that the engagement was effective, and that the effect upon the children was positive, and the effect upon the learning was positive. So they were monitoring all of those features and factors that were happening. As a result of that, because of the changes that had happened since those original models were put together, we devised a new model which took account of digital technologies and the ways in which now communication happens. This is a very small image. So what I've done is I've drawn out the 4 key levels from this. And what we did in this framework was we took it from a perspective of a school leader. So again, we used the idea of levels, but the idea that this is coming from how might a school leader look at this in terms of developing engagement with parents, carers and guardians. And the first level was to establish the communication, build initial connections, then to develop opportunities for parents to engage. How could the parents develop connections with others as well as with them? And that was a very, very important one. It wasn't just connecting but as a one-to-one. It was actually enabling the parents to connect with the community to a greater extent and support. How could the school help the parents to become involved in their children's learning? So, for example, we saw cases where teachers had created videos that they sent out to parents in order to inform them about a particular topic so that they would understand that and be aware of how they might then go on to help their children at home. And then the third level was to maintain that support so that as the needs of parents in the school grew, so they could continue and maintain that support. And the fourth level was to review practices and explore new opportunities. So what we were surprised to see in these cases was that parental engagement was there. It was being supported by schools. It was being encouraged. And as a result, parents were engaged in the sorts of ways that we had seen through previous models and frameworks, and that this was leading to positive outcomes. And those sorts of positive outcomes are reported in a report in an academic paper that we published on this. To go beyond that, we were only looking at that sort of transition period, at those early years areas. We wanted to look beyond that. So as a further investigation, and I'm only here outlining what's happened at this stage, because this hasn't been concluded. This is the part that's now in process. It's been driven, if you like, by the findings that have come through that whole series of work. We had 14 visits to schools, and that included primary, post-primary, i.e. secondary and special in Northern Ireland. That happened last month. What we found from those visits was that across the schools, engagement with parents is increasing, especially in some schools. And what's being found is that the ways that the schools are going about this, and it's in line with that sort of framework and model which we put forward, those schools are finding that parents who have never engaged previously are now engaging as a result of the efforts through the forms of digital technologies that they're using and the ways that they're using those digital technologies. But also parents are becoming more aware of what's happening on a daily basis, through not only through what the schools and the teachers are doing, but also what the children are telling them. So what the learners are giving them in terms of feedback. So that sort of feedback between the parent and the learner is increasing in some of these schools. And again, often being supported by video or audio resources that go out to parents to help them with understanding particular topics or to widen their awareness. They're now finding that parents are driving the communication rather than schools. So whereas in the past, these schools were finding that they were having to drive it, they're now finding that the parents are driving the communication. And that is becoming a separate issue. Some of the parents are wanting to become more and more engaged in supporting learning at home, while others are quite happy that they have a balance. What's happening is, interestingly, that pupil independence is being enhanced in some instances. There were some very crucial, I would say, important examples of where particular pupils and groups of pupils had gained in terms of independence because of the ways that they were able to work, not only at home with parents, but also now in schools with teachers in a different sort of way. And overall, we felt that this really had implications for leaders and how leaders might be leading or managing schools, teaching and learning. We're not indicating that this is universal, but it is interesting that this is arising in certain situations. So we're now questioning whether there are new practices and new models arising. We're questioning whether actually this idea of leadership and engagement is happening more at a community-based level rather than at an individual parent-teacher or parent-school level. We're seeing in some instances more sharing because of the use of digital technologies, not only across the school, but also across parents and between the parents and schools. And we're seeing a shift in terms of the ways in which that learning is happening, going from a formal-based approach to more informal-based approaches and a balance between those. So we do have future questions, which are the ones that we're going to look at next. We don't know how widespread these shifts might be. We don't know whether that will happen in select instances or whether this is tending to happen in a wider number of instances. So we're going to be looking to explore that. We would like to know what the implications are. What are the implications at an individual institution? What implications are there for institutions in the future? And what are the longer term implications and possible directions for education? Does this mean that, in fact, schools, colleges, universities might become rather different in terms of the ways that they are approaching things because of the differences in terms of home base and institution base. Will this affect some forms of changes in the future or not? So these are questions that we don't know the answer to, but that we're certainly interested in. So I think my time is nearly up, and there are the references for the text that I've referred to during this presentation. And I think you know where to contact me anyway. So I'm going to stop there because I hope that I've stimulated sufficient questions to keep us going for a little while longer. So over to you, Phil, if that's okay with you.
That's super. Thanks very much for that, Don. Do you want to just stop sharing your slides, and we'll have a chat. And if you have got a question, then please do feel free to type it into the chat, or just make clear that you want to ask, make some noise, or raise a hand either virtually or turn your camera on and raise it that way if you like. Thanks for the insights, Don. They were, as expected, qualitatively meaningful, right up our street as a seminar series. They were superb. I wonder if I could ask a question in these early few minutes, perhaps while people are warming up. You've worked across a lot of different settings with different participants, different stakeholders, some gatekeepers maybe at arm's length even. Are there any particular groups in any particular settings who you're concerned might be left behind in all this? I mean, I acknowledge, of course, that you've got very humanistic drivers about outcomes for learners, which you mentioned early on. Are there perhaps any groups of, I don't know, parents, carers and guardians who we ought to be particularly concerned about more than others? Or, for those of us who might be able to devote some time and attention in our research, are there any particular groups you might point us towards, do you think?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, Phil. And I think I'm going to answer it in a particular way, which is to say, one of the things that's coming across here as being important, and in a sense is reducing any sorts of division, is this opportunity for sharing. That where there is a desire to share, either across the institution or across the community, whether that be the parent community or whether that be a wider local community, then that seems to be a way of, in some ways, addressing the divides. Because what we've been seeing right across this period of work is that where that's happening, people will chip in and help others. Whether that's with regard to digital competence and understanding, whether that's to do with digital access, whether that's to do with digital devices, whether it's to do with advice, it is happening where that is being encouraged through this form of interaction. Where you're not getting that sharing, that would be the part I think that I would be concerned about in terms of it enabling that divide to exist. So where it is difficult to enable that sharing to happen, I think you have the opportunity for that division to happen. So I think that one of the things that for me that comes out of this entire work, if you like, is that if we can encourage forms of sharing through digital technologies, then we have a chance of supporting people with regard to divides. And we're seeing this in terms of the evidence that's coming out of India, for example, as well as evidence that's coming out of the UK or that's coming out of Croatia or wherever. Yeah, those similar features are happening in terms of the importance of sharing. So I don't know whether that starts to answer your question, Phil.
I think it does, yeah. I suppose by definition that the people we need to focus on are difficult to find, aren't they?
Yes.
Like a lot of educational research. We've got a great question from Maeve. I'm going to read it out, Maeve, but if I'm guilty of mansplaining, please do unmute and just speak over me and I'll shut up. Maeve's asked in the chat, what were the profile of the schools, the socioeconomic groups, parents, mothers working? Would you be able to provide a bit more detail about that?
Yeah, thanks for that, Maeve. The details are in the reports and in the papers that we've published. Basically, we were looking for a diverse group. So we were looking at situations where people were in rural as well as in urban locations, where, for example, where we were looking at schools where there were high levels of social deprivation, lower levels of social deprivation, higher levels of free school meals, and therefore we anticipated that we would get coverage of different groups. We recognized that we were working with small numbers, but given what we wanted to do was to try and get some sort of interesting handle on this as a starter, and therefore we selected down to a relatively small number, but we did go for the highest diversity that we could. So we were looking at small versus large, rural versus urban, high socioeconomic versus low socioeconomic. I hope any more details would be specifically in the papers, Maeve, and I could highlight those and bring those out if that was of interest at this stage.
Hopefully that's answered you, Maeve. If not, just drop us a line. I did put a link in the chat a bit higher up to Don's research profile as well, so you should be able to find things there, and to the STEL special issue. We've got a question from Kathy Chandler. Again, I'll read it out, Kathy, but if you want to unmute, I'll shut up if you start talking, okay? Otherwise, I'll read it out. Kathy says, I'm wondering if one of the roles that parents also adopted during the pandemic, when their children's learning was much more visible to them, was that of an inspector, and whether being more aware of their child's experience has changed their sense of how much they feel they need to engage.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. That's a really very interesting question. I mean, I suppose I would start by saying, of course, there were instances within the pandemic where it was found that actually the forms of parental engagement were negative, i.e., that parents became over demanding, and therefore had a negative effect upon both the forms of interaction that they had with their children, with their learners, but also the outcomes of that learning. So in some instances, we do know that parents had a negative effect, and that often that was down to the fact that they were either they were trying to regulate things to too great an extent, or they were trying to ensure that things were happening in particular ways, etc. So we know that to be the case. What we also know is that quite a lot of parents became much more aware. They say they became more aware of education, what education is trying to do, what forms of learning their children were involved in, and what the outcomes were that were, I wouldn't say expected, but anticipated for those learners. So there was an increase in the case of many parents with regard to how they perceived education and how they perceived the value of education and what education was attempting to achieve. That in itself, I think, is quite a move forward. We don't always know exactly to what extent that happened, because we don't have very large data from many places. We have large data from some places, but not very many. But we do know that happened. I think to some extent there were parents who were taking more of an inspection role, i.e., they were monitoring what was happening. They were monitoring the ways in which their their children were engaging with, for example, online learning, with other children online, with activities that were being put forward by teachers, not only online, but also those activities that were asking children to do at home, offline. So they were inspecting or monitoring in that way. And I think as a result of that, certainly that level of awareness would have happened. It would have increased. And that's how that was arising. I think also there were parents who just became much more interested in the topics that were being taught and that were happening, and they engage because they recognized that it was something that either they had been interested in and it had rekindled their interest, or they were topics that they just didn't know about and that they found that they had an interest in finding out more. So in some cases, they were actually learning along with their children. And I think it's that's driven some teachers now to produce these audio or video resources that go out to parents in order to help them to understand topics that they might not have felt that they understood fully. Thanks, Richard. So thanks, Kathy. I hope that helps to answer your question a bit.
It's a great question.
Thank you. Yes, it does. I was thinking about my experience as a parent during the pandemic, you know, and just the opportunities that opened up for me, really, being able to see what was going on. You know, the school suddenly became a lot more visible. So it's, yeah, really interesting to hear your reflections. Thank you. Thanks,
Kathy. Yeah, I think I think, I mean, looking at it also from the other perspective, what was also interesting was how many teachers and principals have said to us that it actually opened up the homes to them, that they were often quite surprised at the fact that the parents and families were willing to, in essence, open up their homes more to them as teachers and the school. And as a result of that, they gained, in terms of understanding home situations, parents, families, to a much greater extent. So I think that there was also something that was happening reciprocally there, in terms of that happening in both directions. So there tended to be this sort of greater mutual understanding in some cases that was arising, which I think was fascinating.
It's a really interesting scenario. Hundreds of millions of people around the world having a shared experience, but in very unique ways. What a great thing to research. From the perspective of a researcher and scholar who's been doing a lot of this stuff, Don, you explained it in 2021. In your 2021 paper, you described these 6 shifts about, I think it was medium, mode, environment and role, that kind of thing. If we looked back pre-COVID and we looked at, say, shifting levels of engagement, think these models by Epstein, Hoover, Dempsey and Sandler, and motivational drivers by, I think, Walker et al. Do you think something like adapting to COVID, has it accelerated the way people might go through those model levels, or did it just completely destabilize those models to a point where we now need to be critical about any pre-COVID model, and we need instead to look at these, like your community-based 4-field model? Is that where we're at in terms of the methodology and methods level decisions? Do we have to now say, oh, hold on, this was pre-COVID?
I think that's a really interesting question, Phil. I mean, I wouldn't like to over, to take things too far on this, but I would say that anything that was derived pre-COVID is worth looking at and exploring as to whether it applies post-COVID, because undoubtedly the COVID period did bring about it not only brought about changes that were to do with practice and the ways that people could practice, it actually changed, in some respects, behaviors, it changed attitudes, it changed, it also brought about changes in terms of understanding with regard to different, shall I say, social and psychological issues, challenges, concerns, etc. And all of the models that were produced pre-COVID might not have taken them into account as much. I'm not saying that that would happen for all models or all frameworks that would be to do with education, but I definitely think it's worth looking at. Certainly what we were finding was that when we were looking at those pre-technology and COVID models, that there were perspectives that they were taking which were based upon some of the ways in which the practice was originally conceived. So the whole basis of the educational system was often based upon an idea of a progression across time, rather than it being thought about in terms of an holistic approach to learning in terms of developing lifelong considerations and practice. So this idea of learning and education being something to do with a process over time, in some respects, actually with digital technologies and during COVID, has been shifted, because in some respects the idea of age, the idea of responding to particular cohorts and groups, for example, has shifted in many respects. And we're now talking about I think there is a shift in terms of how we might be thinking about the underpinning ideas that created those frameworks, and we have to go back to that and say, do those still hold or not? And yes, we still at the moment regard education as a progression, but do we regard it as a progression in the same way as we did prior to the use of technologies and prior to COVID? I would say there could be shifts there.
Yeah, I mean, we also can't look back with rose-tinted nostalgia and have ever expected those researchers to predict a global pandemic, I suppose, can we? I wonder if that's in the psyche of, a lot of educational researchers like yourself and people on the call at the minute, that, how do we predict for these, massive things when we're extending theory and maybe proposing models and things like that,
Yeah, I mean, I think again that's a really interesting one. The ways in which I mean, during my time of looking at education and looking at it from a policy practice research perspective, the shifts that have happened have undoubtedly happened in some respects more rapidly. Partly that's because of the rapid changes that are happening in technology, but it's also to do with the ways in which that technology is affecting other features like communication, like sharing, like opportunity, like access. Those things are shifting and they're shifting increasingly. So I would say, from an educational research perspective, that is actually opening up opportunities on the one hand, because it means that we need to explore those shift and change perhaps more regularly in an ongoing basis. But on the other hand, it produces challenges, because it means that to do that, those who want those outcomes from our research want them more quickly. So in order to be able to understand how they work in a contemporary situation, because that contemporary situation might actually shift quite dramatically, quite quickly. So we have, I think from a research perspective, from an academic point of view, I would say we're in interesting times. But also from an academic point of view, I'd say we're moving into quite challenging times, because the ways in which our research will be needed will be increased, but the amount of time that we will have to do it, and therefore being able to do things over a longer period of time, might become more challenging. But that you can tell me in 20 years' time if I'm wrong on that. I don't mind.
I don't know. I think we'll still be wondering, won't we? There's that old Confucian curse, isn't there? May you live in interesting times.
Yeah.
Probably what you were moving us towards. I don't want to monopolize the questions. We'll just see if any more come through on the chat. I think you've given us a right treat there. Is there, just to kind of start moving us towards concluding, is there a particular I suppose family of theoretical approaches or methodological techniques that you'd sort of favor? Is there anything that you'd particularly think is apposite for research with not just the people who are involved in the teaching learning interactions, but kind of stretching that, I suppose, that whole notion of sharing and independence and formal and informal, and stretching or traditional conceptions of who's involved in this? Is there any particular way you're drawn to the analysis and the design and things like that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've been a mixed methods researcher for a long time, and I still see the value of mixed methods within this sort of area.
Sure.
And I guess that you probably recognize that from the sorts of questions that I like to ask. So I like to ask things like, to what extent is this happening? I am interested in that, because that will tell me something about the sort of trends that might be happening, where they might be going, what we might be able to say about the future. So I'm interested in it from that sort of quantitative perspective, and I think that that's potentially important. We also need to know those sorts of things in order to be able to address particular areas of issue. You mentioned areas of divide. We need to know the extent of divide at any one time, and therefore, how we might be able to address that. But then again, we can only do that, I believe, if we have qualitative evidence that enables us to understand why something is happening and how it can be addressed, and the sorts of reasoning behind things. So we need that in-depth investigation, as well as the broader ideas of trends. So my interest really is in how we can use that blend of quantitative and qualitative focus in order to support the future direction and the future success of where we might be going in terms of education. So for me, those two elements are important. And personally, I mean, as a researcher, I use both. I use mixed methods, but on the other hand, if individuals want to focus on qualitative or quantitative, and those perspectives enable us to gather a more mixed methods thinking from the two sets of evidence, then I'm perfectly happy. If we can see the links between those and can make the connections between them. And that was one of the interesting things that came out of the papers that were in the STEL issue, that some of them were coming very much from a qualitative point of view, others were coming from a quantitative point of view, but it was possible across that scenario to get an idea of the sorts of things that were happening, why they were happening, and some of the ways that we might approach it in the future. And for me, that was really important.
Yeah, it was certainly a showcase of what we might describe as trustworthiness, where you could pick any of those papers and actually the editorial up, and if your opinion went this way and the papers went that way, you still knew why, and you could still engage with it and understand why you were diverging. It was great. Look, as much as I think we could listen to you all day long, Don, I think you've got a lot of other people waiting to access your time and wisdom. It's almost time for us to say cheerio. So thanks again for taking the time and effort that you've invested in us, and we wish you well with what's next. In terms of the series, our next online seminar will take place on Wednesday, the 29th of May. 2024. It will be presented by Catherine Atkinson and Wei Yuan Wu from the Institute of Education at the University of Manchester. And the title is Inside the Chinese Heterosexual Matrix, Exploring Sexuality, Leader Identity and Agency Among Lesbian and Gay Mid-Level School Leaders in China. So please do drop Dear line if you'd like to join us for that, and if you'd like to be added to Dee's mailing list for the series. There'll be a few thanks coming in on the chat, I think, Don, and thanks very much again. Very kind of you to take the time to spend with us.
No problem. My pleasure, and thanks to everyone for coming along and for participating and having the patience to listen to me. And if you have any questions at any point, that's no problem. I can always find someone else to answer them for me. Okay.
Superb. Thanks very much. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thanks.